Good morning. We're so glad you've tuned into Westminster's live stream for this live Q&A with Reverend Dr. Shively Smith. My name is Rachel Schill Gustafson, and I'm the Director of Engagement at Westminster Presbyterian Church here in Minneapolis. Matt Skinner is also joining us this morning as Scholar for Adult Education, and of course, Dr. Smith. Reverend Dr. Shively T.J. Smith serves as Assistant Professor of New Testament at Boston University School of Theology in Boston, Massachusetts. She completed her PhD in New Testament Studies at Emory University. She published her book, Strangers to Family, Diaspora, and First Peter's Invention of God's Household with Baylor University Press. She is completing a commentary on 2 Peter for SBL Press and several articles on 19th century African American women writers and the Bible. As a scholar of New Testament, Smith writes and teaches on all 27 books of the New Testament, but her particular focus is on the letters from Hebrews to Jude in the New Testament, approaches to biblical interpretation, womanist and African American biblical interpretation, and Howard Thurman. Smith is an ordained itinerant elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, where she proudly serves as member and resident scholar at the historic Metropolitan AME Church in Washington, D.C. For all of you tuning in, we're so glad you're here. You'll have opportunities to ask questions via our live stream and Facebook chat. You can enter your questions there and we'll sort through them to ask Dr. Smith, and you can enter those at any time. Good morning, Dr. Smith. Thank you so much for being here.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
We're so glad you're here again for a second session, and we're excited to get to the Q&A. But first, for those who weren't able to tune in for last week's session, would you mind giving us a few highlights?
Sure. The session last week really is sort of taking up was more of a sort of taste, a small taste of some of my work in terms of interacting with the biblical text using the resources of African American history and in particular African American art to sort of inform and shape what I pay attention to in the biblical text. So watching Jesus hang, the presentation, rereading the crucifixion story, particularly the Gospel of Mark's version of the crucifixion using African American art and artistry, so from poetry to actual visual arts from the Harlem Renaissance, is just a piece or a taste of a larger work that I'm doing. Actually, finishing doing, have submitted an article that's called Watching Jesus Hang, a rereading of Mary Magdalene's view of Jesus dying on the cross through Ida B. Wells' Lynch Chronicles. So, I mean, so this is, you got a taste of an approach of what's forming and shaping a lot of my interpretive work right now. So, and I hope you were challenged by it. I hope it was a refreshing, and I hope that it sort of helps us to pay attention to other aspects of the text that we may miss.
I'm so glad you're with us, Shively. It's good to have you here and to share you with the people at Westminster. So thanks.
So glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. So I was really, I loved last week because, like you, I'm a biblical scholar.
Right.
Like you, I teach in churches, and like you, I am not trained in how to interpret art, like at all.
Right.
But I love using art when I teach, just as a way of broadening perspective and helping people bridge that ancient modern divide sometimes. And so I really appreciate that. You've encouraged me. Yeah, but I wanted to ask you to get started, maybe more of a Mark question than an art question, since
okay.
That's our strong point. I mean, you talked about how the spectacle in Mark's description is one that tries to get us to participate. It tries to pull us into the story as if we are observers or witnesses, more so than standing at a far distance or having it explained to us or something like that. At the same time, Mark's also the one of the four Gospels that, at least I think, says the least about the function of the cross, or what is it going to accomplish or affect. And so we come to the cross in Mark, I think, really with a sense of confusion or tragedy. Even though Jesus has talked about it, we're like, what good could this possibly serve? At least I read it. How does that affect the way you read Mark and the way you think about how a good artistic or a provocative artistic representation of the crucifixion might look like, to have that sense of what is going on here and why could this possibly be a good thing?
Yeah. So I'm going to answer that question, but first I must echo your disclaimer to say that's my disclaimer as well. I'm not trained as an artist, as an art historian. So the ways in which I'm using art, if there are art historians, a specialist on here, sort of, I'm waving the white flag to say, take it easy on me in terms of how I use art. But talking about Mark is very interesting in all the ways that you named, Matt, for me. Not only do we arrive at the crucifixion moment, in some ways we are expecting it because of what Jesus said, but the rationale for it isn't developed in Mark leading up to it, and it's not developed afterwards. So this sort of sudden ending in Mark 16:8. So we don't have what we end up finding in some place like Luke, where we get all of these appearance accounts and this sort of the way in which we're now able to, with the stories of the appearance of resurrected Jesus, sort of get this speaking back to that moment and a recontextualizing of it. Mark doesn't give us that even after the fact. So there is a way in which Mark seems to be the most underdeveloped around the rationale for it, which is actually the reason why I like playing with Mark on this matter of crucifixion. So Luke for me has a little bit, gives us a little bit more development. All of them do. Mark's vagueness around this moment means there's real opportunity to use other resources and to feel that void with these lenses of others. For me, particularly African American history and what this moment signifies, what this moment represents, why this moment exists. So I purposely use Mark in this sort of interpretive work for the very reason that the absence of a clear rationale means now there's an opportunity to think in any number of ways about the question of not only why this happened, but its impact and what should we be paying attention to now. The participation aspect of Mark's storytelling is very important to me, because I think what Mark does well and develops well to me in the account is in fact the opportunity for us as readers and or hearers to participate in that moment in a way that is not just cerebral. And so again, I introduce art to try to help us to get out of our heads and to really enter the moment of observation, not just from the standpoint of awe or even shock, but observation from the standpoint of a question. Why is this happening? How is this happening? How do I feel about it? I think Mark creates the opportunity for us to sit with those questions. Yeah.
I was struck by your description of the observers as spectators and the corollary word spectacle. Those words can have both negative and positive connotations. Can you tell us a little bit more about why you chose those words specifically?
Yeah, so I chose those words on one level for exactly because of the tension that you're naming. But so that's one piece of it. I'll come back to that. The first piece, really spectacle, comes from sort of the recognition of the fact that historically speaking, in the Roman world, that's exactly what the crucifixion was intended to do. It was intended to be a spectacle of what the empire will do to different groups. What a lot of times gets missed, I think, in our Christian context is the question of, so who actually are the victims of this very normal Roman practice of execution and crucifixion? Usually they are slaves of the state, and then they are rebels of the rebels, or people who are considered to be agitators of the empire. So they're either people of the slave servant class in the Roman Empire, or they're people that the empire has deemed agitators, people who are rebels, who are encouraging people to revolt and push against the state. These are the two major classes. There's a third, but these are the two that I pay attention to the most, because when you look at the histories of these are the two groups that sort of, to me, dominate a lot of times in some of the stories of the Greco-Roman historians and so forth. And so the point of the crucifixion was not just punishment, it was warning. It was to make a very big spectacle of what happens to classes of people that the empire already deems as expendable, or classes of people that challenge empire. And so it's intended to be seen. It is intended to be in some levels entertainment. You see this with in the different portrayals of the soldiers and how they're enjoying. On one level, it is entertainment for certain classes of people that are participating in it or around it. And it's intended to be seen as a warning to not, in fact, engage in anything that challenges the power of the empire. So I push it to spectacle, to be a bit disruptive, to force us as Christian readers to be more historically accurate about the moment. This is not a happy moment. This is not an accidental moment. This is not a moment that's unusual. This is a common spectator moment, spectacle moment, that is the machinations of empire, period. The piece about spectator for me also has something to do with recognizing who participates and who doesn't, or the different forms or textures of participation around this moment. So it's really interesting. One of my more popular historians who I love, who's been making her rounds on media during this season, Doris Kearns, she wrote the book I just finished, Leadership in Turbulent Times. So I just, anytime she's on, I watch her. I love all of her works. This week, she was talking about making the distinction literally between the role of spectating in a process and the role of participating in a process. She specifically said, democracy is not about spectating. Democracy is explicitly about participating in the process. And I said, that is what I mean. In the crucifixion moment, it is about the center of it is about the spectating moment. And then there are these different people that participate in it in different ways. But what leads is the spectator, is the intention of creating a moment that people view and observe. It's not a moment of creating space where people participate in it to stop it, participate in it to be transformed towards a greater humanity. If they're transformed, they should be transformed not towards being emboldened, but to be more afraid and tentative, right? And of what empire can do. So that's really important to me. So I gave you a few different nuances on one level. One is spectacle has everything to do with recognizing that's what it was intended to do in the ancient world by Roman Empire, and the other is to begin to nuance the difference between spectating as entertainment in an environment in which the central orientation should be we participate in the process, whereas in this case the central orientation is you spectate. We participate in spectating the process in order to be made in order to be transformed into people that are more afraid of empire and power rather than people that push against it.
It's really hard not to hear everything you were talking about through the events of this year here in Minneapolis with George Floyd. And of course, he's not the first Black man to die in police hands here in our city. And of course, not historically either. You're talking a little bit about spectator and kind of the ways that we participate directly or indirectly. I know this is a hard question. It may be hard to start out with early, especially, but Could you talk a little bit about the application for today as we're growing more conscious of what public lynchings look like on our streets, or at least some of us are growing more conscious. Some have been for a long time, but I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts for those of us here in Minneapolis.
Yeah, so I think that the entire piece that I shared with you is sort of my response to this. And so the first is to say, um, so I'm going to talk about it from the angle of how I was interpreting the crucifixion, but it's related to this. One, my process that produced the piece and that's continuing to produce the piece starts first and foremost with the recognition that I am shaped and formed by a particular kind of culture, church culture and tradition, that the creeds I am a PK of Baptist and Pentecostal family, grand PK, niece PK, everyone in my family, they're pastors, deacons or something, elders. And I found my voice with and graded, voice within Methodist circles and quite frankly, Presbyterian circles. I went to Columbia Theological Seminary for my THM and so these have been these are the spaces that have shaped me and my reading practices and what and how I do my work and interpret and what I do on Sunday in spaces. And so in church and worship spaces. And so my process that you got to participate in represents me saying, I'm suspicious about my formation. I'm suspicious that there may be more here that I am not able to see, hear, notice, because I've been shaped and formed in a particular way for what is important in the crucifixion moment, by the songs, by the Christmas pageants that I love participating in as a child. Like that was a very important thing. Am I here? Was the Christian pageants, right? And the Christmas pageants and getting ready for that. So there's one way in which I hold those things with great pride and joy, and you can see the joy in me like that. Those are major parts of who I am. I also recognize that formation may have created blinders. And so one of the pieces that I think we have to do when we start thinking about to what degree are we spectators is to begin to think about what are the sources, voices, and perspectives that I hear clearly, feel comfortable with, that have shaped me, and what are the voices and perspectives that just have not been a part of forming me, of informing what I see, what I pay attention to, what I notice. And so how do I begin to hear and see the world differently? So I used the art, I used Ida B. Wells, I used any number of other voices, because I don't trust that I am seeing everything. And I don't trust that I can see or hear everything because I've been formed in a certain way. I think that's the same thing in this moment, that this moment really is about us figuring out, even with all of the divisiveness and the polarization, how do we invite the stories and the voices and the experiences of others into our space so that we not only offer charitable listening, that we just listen, but that we listen in a way that it shifts us, it disrupts us, it begins to carve out a new pathway of understanding, a new way of being. So it's not just the listening, moving from spectator to participating is taking in those other perspectives and then letting those guide the way you engage the text, the way you engage the moment, the way you engage communities, even if you've never engaged it that way. So I've written on mark some for different commentaries. Matt knows about these. We always have these different commentary projects, and we got working preacher, but there's any number of different things that those of us who are biblical scholars who care about the church and are doing that work and care about society are doing that work. We cross these lines all the time. I've engaged this story before, but it wasn't until I started centering other voices, other aesthetics, and letting them tell me what to pay attention to. And then I did it and I do it, that things started shifting for me. They continue to shift for me. So, I mean, that's a long answer to say the project itself is my answer to this. It's not just hearing, it's doing something with it.
You talked about, you last week talked about James Barthé's sculpture and how ultimately that was taken off the table. And when you mentioned his sculpture, I thought of other more contemporary work I had seen that was reminiscent of it. Tylon J. Sawyer's Black Pieta, Renee Cox's Yo Mama's Pieta. There's a John Henry collection of photographs he calls Stranger Fruit. And when I went online to kind of refresh my memory, I saw, again, a whole bunch of commentary, objecting to these representations. And so, of course, these kinds of things are still being taken off the table. Is there a place we can still find them? How do we still listen to them today? Yeah. Where can we seek them out?
I think this is part of the dilemma that I'm trying to map. All of these readings, these interpretive and artistic expressions, most of them will be contested because they're not mainstream. They don't maintain the status quo. They put new bodies as the images of Jesus and the crucified. I mean, that it changes the entire, again, visual formation that many of us have, which is all the more reason why we have to listen, right? And you listen and you go to and you say, well, expecting them not to be, you expect the commentary. So you expect them not to, the very disruption that they create is exactly what is needed. And it's also the problem and the challenge, which I would say, I would be interested in Matt to say this, I would say in our field, period, there's certain interpretive outcomes, interpretive products is what I like to talk about, that are common and traditional, that keep everything the same, keep certain bodies and certain experiences centered. And there are other interpretive products and opportunities that are equally viable that aren't centered. So I think that that's normal, that's what happens. So here's the piece that's interesting for me, and why I picked the Harlem Renaissance period. So one of the things that people miss that makes the Harlem Renaissance period so intriguing, the Harlem Renaissance from the 1920s, and then there's argument about to what degree does it go into the 1930s. I like to give it a long period of time. So usually I'll say the Harlem Renaissance really does end in 1935 with the riots and so forth. But one of the things that makes the Harlem Renaissance was the way in which these artists, writers, literature, the aesthetics, all of that, visual arts, literary arts, intellectual scholars, they were all in this place, but they were getting the attention of not just Black communities, but quite frankly, European and European American communities. So this is the place where people were coming to engage in both, the dances and then also to experience culture. So this is the heyday where African American art and literature and thinking is on the main stage as the end thing, not just for African Americans, but for European America, as very important. So it's center stage. And so one of the reasons why I like using the Harlem Renaissance period is to say, this is the moment when the African and African American aesthetic in particular is being supported, being paid attention to, and it's only a little bit more than a decade There are resources pouring in for it. Even in this moment, there's great challenge to it. Um, and yet, and yet, uh, there's a way in which these artists and these thinkers and these scholars and writers recognize that no matter what, they have to put forward these all other versions or visions of the crucifixion, other versions and poetry, interpretive works, interpreting the Christian text and any number of other African American history, and so forth. And so I love it because for me, I say, so this isn't something new. I'm not talking about a new interpretive approach. I'm really talking about retrieving and centering and saying, what happens when we let this really be the center of how we come to the biblical text, and that these experiences and voices and perspectives shape and get to have the first voice, almost the pulpit, so to speak, of how we hear these texts and approach them. How does that change our relationality to each other? How does that change our relationality to the world outside of our church walls, to other communities? What kind of demands does that make on us to re-envision ourselves differently in relationship to people in ways that are disruptive and challenge us? So I love the Harlem Renaissance period and what comes out of that period, for the ways in which it represents a certain kind of resilience and interpretive courage, even audacity, that I think we in our churches need to exhibit more of. That we have to be a little bit courageous to create an alternative vision of the crucifixion moment, an alternative vision of the resurrection moment, an alternative vision of even, Jesus being baptized by John. Like that takes audacity to push against some of our formations and our natural visioning of these moments in a new way. And I love the audacity that the Harlem Renaissance interpreters, as I like to call them, demonstrated in the artifacts that they have left us.
I wonder if some of the pushback that we were talking about, like Rachel mentioned some contemporary artists whose work is criticized for supposedly blurring some boundaries that aren't supposed to be blurred. You talked about how that works in church and in academy, Shively, and I don't know. And I think about Barthes as well. You said he finally destroyed the work because the sculpture, because of the controversy around it.
Yeah.
And you even criticized him for perhaps not being courageous enough, for not being able to live in a time where he had the courage to be able to keep that out there. And it makes me wonder, and I don't know the answer to this question at all. So one of those questions. Some people object, I think, to what they see as a kind of unfair blurring of the contemporary with the ancient or something like that. And some of that's just small-mindedness or even racism. But some of that, I think, for some people is a desire to protect the uniqueness of Jesus and his death, especially when it comes to portrayals of the crucifixion. I wonder if there's a danger there or not, or what you would say to those who think that somehow this is maybe cheapening Jesus's death to start finding all of these comparisons across time and space. I don't think that's what you're saying, but it's a pushback that I think I've heard in different language and different settings before.
Yeah, I've heard it and continue to hear it. On one level, I hear it because, as I said, I'm formed in circles. I mean, those are people that I love. Any given time, I would be getting ready to go across the country to go, for Thanksgiving and any other number of things. So I'm not even talking. I'm talking about what's right there in my own family circle. So I hear that. That makes me sad to be. So I may not have the most scholarly response. Excuse me, Matt, for saying that. So I'm going to have a very human response if I'm allowed to do that.
I actually would prefer the human response over the.
That makes me sad because most of the time when I hear that, what runs very closely is this profession of the unending revelation of God and and that 2,000 years later, God is still present with us. And I think to myself, then why is it that that this crucifixion moment can only be left in the first century? Like why can't the challenge be ever present to us? That what if the good news is that what makes Jesus important is that Jesus reminds us, is our daily reminder, our faith is community based, is the crucifixion is the constant reminder of the fact that if we are not careful, we crucify Jesus over and over again, that it's not just a past moment, that if we really are believing in the ongoing revelation of God, that the revelation is that there's always a danger that Jesus is being crucified again right there in your midst. And the fact that we want to leave Jesus untouched in the first century on the cross or resurrected, right, back then, really isn't living up to our own profession of faith. And that makes me sad, because I think that is how we can watch. Some of us can watch a Floyd, or for me, Breonna Taylor is closer. I'm from Louisville, Kentucky, so where Breonna was killed is actually around the corner where I do go home to visit. So there's a way in which it's hit me very hard. I was writing about the Say Her Name campaign back in 2015 and 2016. So I've been involved in that conversation. So for me, Breonna Taylor is close, because I said there's a block difference between that could have just been me at my aunt's house, at my aunt's apartment, or my daughter's, and they could have been stormed. I mean, so there's a real, and I think the sounds, the outcomes, the terror of the crucifixion moment doesn't stop 2,000 years ago. It's happening right here in our midst. And the same way that we want to hold on to Jesus then, I think things could change if we would hold on to that Jesus now. So I'm not at Eastertide, and during Lent, just thinking about heading to the cross 2,000 years ago. I'm thinking about, I'm seeing the crucifixion now in this moment and letting it do its work, heighten my awareness of my humanity and my responsibility to care, not just about the communities and peoples and Jesus and the disciples 2,000 years ago, but the Jesus and the disciples and the followers of God right now in my midst. That is the work of the good news, I think. That's probably not as connected as normal, but it's connected in peace. But that's my human answer. That I am sad when we segregate and want to isolate the crucifixion moment and keep it set in the past, when at the same time that we're talking about revelation that is ever present. And that is the one thing that should make us most human.
That's a great answer, a moving answer. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
As you're talking about that human connection, that sense of proximity, and you mentioned your daughters. I have daughters too, and I guess I'm curious if you would offer us a little bit of particular reflection on the women at the scene of the crucifixion. And as a womanist theologian, of course, there's long and rich commentary reflecting on this, but maybe even just kind of a brief, could you tell us briefly a little bit, just share a little bit about that, and maybe even as it relates to Breonna? I would love to hear from you.
Yeah. So as I shared at the beginning, what I shared with you is a sort of spin-off of work that's already submitted and will be published in 2021, with looking at this crucifixion moment, paying attention to Mary Magdalene and the women's view, and sort of saying, what does it look like to participate from this angle? And I used Ida B. Wells. I used Ida B. Wells to help me figure that out a little bit. So two things. So I guess one is kind of funny, like tongue and cheek, kind of funny. What is to say, yeah, so I don't tend to really trust the male figures in the text too much anyways. So I hope this doesn't mean they don't want to hear from me anymore. But
I hope not too.
so one of my hermeneutics of suspicion pieces is I tend to look for where are the women in this story? Where are the children in this story? And I like to pay attention to I'll talk about where are the poor in this story, and then I talk about where are their margin, people that are sort of, where are the margins in this story, and what are they saying, what are they doing, what would their voices and views be like? And I asked that question knowing that the biblical text and most of the documents that we have from the ancient world are not going to give me that answer, because that's the resources that we have, and Matt can back me up if you think I'm going wrong with this, but the resources that we have from the ancient world do not come from the marginal spaces per se. They come from, especially the ones that we lift up, they come from the center. They come from people with power, people who can afford to produce the writings and the histories and so forth and so on. So it's skewed against them. So that's the first thing. I love looking for the women in the text first anyway. The second thing that I would say that I learned from them, especially with my daughters. I mean, so part of this is my daughters, is to say, my youngest daughter in particular, Claudia, who's 8. And so we were talking about this over the summer, and I said, we were watching some documentaries, just trying to help her process the moment. And we were reading the story, and I was reading it to her, and she said, so did they just keep looking? And I said, what? It's just like, I don't know if I could keep looking. This 8-year-old, I think she was 7 at the time. She said, they just kept looking? I don't think I want to keep looking at that. And I thought, that is like an amazing, amazing observation. Like, is this something that you really want to watch? Right. And what does it mean that they just kept looking, that they stood by watching until its conclusion? What does that say about their courage? What does that say about what they may be modeling for us? Like, you don't avert your eyes. You watch the spectacle, recognizing how horrible and inhumane it is. It's almost like this is what bearing witness is, right? So you bear witness by standing there flat-footing and seeing this for what it is. And what happens if this is the real moment of witness in the gospel? It is in fact these women standing there, as Claudia said, just watching this unfold. So that's what led me to Ida B. Wells. So Ida B. Wells embarks on this huge sociological work, going all over the country, creating an accounting of the history of lynching and all of the mob violence that's occurred. Really, she's asking the question, why did this happen? Because she was suspicious. She was a journalist herself. So she was suspicious of the popular reporting of these lynchings, because the news media newspaper reportings on these always ended up saying basically that these Black people deserved to be lynched because there was a rape that happened, there was a theft that happened. So they gave a rationale. She was suspicious that that was not the truth. So she started going to all of the places, asking questions, and ended up discovering that all of that reporting was false. Most of that reporting was false, that these are not the reasons that led up to these moments. So in some ways, for me, Ida B. Wells becomes a person who just kept looking. Right.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No,
well, you talk about that, and there's obviously a risk to that for Ida B. Wells. And you talked about the women watching from a distance in Mark. There's a political risk there if the Romans are taking names about who's watching this and who's taking. It's not just, I'm going to do this as an act of compassion. It's putting yourself in the gap, right?
And is that not the part too that's exciting, that it is the watching does come with risk, with the recognition that you yourself could become a target, you another victim of the spectator sport of the empire, or you as Ida B. Wells, her initial she ended up owning this her own newspaper, and it was burned down, and she was run out of town in Tennessee, and had to come up to, she ended up moving to Chicago and then doing work all over. But at the end of her life, her life ends with her being very much isolated by both communities. So by her own community, by a Black community in real ways, as well as larger white American community at the time. I mean, she did all of this work, and at the end, there was this sort of dissonance for her. So I think that there are risks, but I think that those are risks that we have to be willing, I think, to take. And I think the good news is that even in the risk that we take in these death-dealing moments, there's yet life that can occur. So I'll answer it this way, in some way. So you know this, I said before, before I came here, I'm always doing the opening meditation and worship for the cathedral of the AME Church. And today I used a speech from Shirley Chisholm, and then a speech from Ella Baker, both who I would say took major risk and stuff and didn't get to see what they were pushing for come to fruition. And yet there's a real way that those risks that they took are the reason why we're here now, I think. And so for me, I think to keep looking isn't just about the heart. It's not just about the head. It's not just about the hand. It's about all of it. Head, hand, and heart. We look, we take the risk of paying attention. We take the risk of bearing witness, maybe not for ourselves, but for those who are yet to come. Howard Thurman would say, and this frames probably a lot of my work, and I know I might be able to take one more question. Howard Thurman, at the end of his autobiography, with heart and head, says that I take my stand for the future, for the generations that have yet to come, with head and heart. And he says more, but I find that so powerful. I take my stand for the future, with head and with heart. And for me, that's what I see happening with the women in the biblical text. They're taking a stand for a future they may not be able to see. That's why I'm pulling from some of the history and artifacts of African American history in particular right now, because I think that they were taking a stand in the 1920s and the 1930s. Barté becomes very complex because to me, he represents the real challenge of doing that, the real pressures and dangers that come with doing that. So that I can be here with you today and we can be having this conversation. And that has to be named. Yeah.
Well, I see aspects of that even in the things you're saying this morning in terms of that taking of a stand. So Thanks. We still have more time. We got till quarter after.
Oh, good.
We got you. But I wonder if this is connected in some way to some of what you were saying earlier in that answer about transformation. One of the questions that we received from somebody who watched last week was what your take is on the centurion in Mark.
Yeah.
That confession, is that a sarcastic moment? Is that just more spectacle or sneering from the umpire, or does something happen in that moment? I mean, how does that fit the way, or how does it fit your
Yeah.
imagination, which is obviously a wide, robust imagination around the
I was going to say that changes from day to day for me. So one of the things that I do is I take seriously that the biblical text is living. So I always say, yeah, so that's what I thought yesterday. I've changed my mind today. Or I can write something.
That's why we ask for forgiveness on Sunday.
Right. Like, okay, this is what I got today that may change tomorrow. So all that goes to say the centurion is a fascinating figure to me, because I think that ambiguity in Mark allows us to see this figure in all of those different, from all of these different angles. So some moments, it's helpful for me to read the centurion and see this as a moment of transformation, because I need to be encouraged that transformation could still happen, right? So that people can be bearing witness, and something happens to them, emboldens them, right? To take the next step. So sometimes I read the centurion and feel encouraged that transformation becomes embodied, it gets acted out in ways that make ripple effects. Sometimes I read it and I say, this guy's just, I think it's sarcastic. I think he's participating in the rituals of the spectacle of the entertainment. And it's what we do when we go to, football games and basketball games. He's participating in the fun, in the sport of the piece. And so so sometimes I read it that way and have interpreted it that way. I always think that there's a third space there. I always think that there's always an opportunity of trying to think about the best way to say this. I have not changed my mind about things. There are values that I have had or thought that I have become stronger and more vocal and more in my positions. But I can remember certain times where I may have had those thoughts, but I participated in the sport of another view, a counter view, because I wasn't as strong in it. So initially I was participating, going along, even though inside I kind of was thinking, I'm not sure if I really buy that. I'm not sure I really think that. And so sometimes I look at him in that complicated middle liminal space, that on one level, he is in a group with others and he says what everybody else is saying, maybe even with the attitude and tone that everyone said it. So they think that he's just participating in the sport. But really, there's transformation that's happening. And we don't get to follow the centurion beyond that moment. But that moment actually represented the beginning of a change that continued for him. So yes, he said it in sport, but there was actually truth there that he knew was truthful, that's going to continue to do his work. And so sometimes I think about it in that complicated space. Again, I say, because I think that that's human. I don't think that we all as human beings, sometimes we're not always as vocal or courageous at one point in our life, but we can see that we've gotten stronger in that belief system. We've gotten stronger in what it means to be more inclusive, more affirming. We've gotten stronger in what it means to see people that we're used to not seeing as our equal and that's centering their experiences. We kind of always had that kind of thought, but now we've gotten better, stronger, and acting it out. What happens if the centurion represents that moment? It looks like he's going along with everyone, but really something is happening. He actually spoke out the space that is disrupted for him. And it continues to disrupt him after the story has moved on. The story moves on and he is stuck with that proclamation. So that's kind of 3 different ways in which I read it. Again, it just
I
depends
love
what
that.
day it is.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I love that. As you're talking about sort of this embodied way of engaging with scripture, I'm thinking about how you discussed how critical it has been to the African American biblical interpretive tradition to kind of do that, to highlight the sensory experience. And I grew up in a church similar to the one you described, where there were, we had the Easter pageant every year, and where it was a spectacle. I mean, we emphasized like the most painful, bloody things about it. I mean, some of these were very, very just getting really gritty and really real. And I remember as a child having to sort of distance myself from that sensory experience to even watch the Easter pageant, And I think about one of the things I loved about you highlighting that was this persistent call back into the sensory element of it, the embodiment of sort of what this really means to watch this happen. And how important that is to kind of stay human, not just in our engagement with the crucifixion, but with our engagement with continued crucifixions. And there are times in my own life when I've been more or less able to kind of be connected to the reality of it. And I guess, could you talk a little about that in your own experience?
Yeah, I will. Thank you for that, Rachel. So there's a little bit of a calibration I want to make, so that I don't think biblical scholars have done a good job of capturing the sensory piece, whether they're African American or European American. Like, I actually am very Matt, don't tell anybody this, but I'm actually very suspicious of us. That I don't know if I'm not clear that we are really good at capturing the sensory nature of it, which is why I go to the arts to do that. And so that's the first thing. So technically, the resources that I gave you aren't necessarily African American biblical interpretive resources. They're interpretations of the moment from African American history and aesthetics, right? And I kind of leave the scholars to the side. The reason why I do that is because I do think, art, poetry, visual arts, that comes from places of not just the head and the hand, but the heart. Like, it's all 3 wrapped up together that creates a different space for us to read things and see things. And so I see that I used art. I use art from African American history, be it poetry, be it visual arts, to heighten my awareness and sensitivity to the bodily elements, the real physical experiential elements of text, because I don't think I can get there by my head alone. And I don't think, as a formally trained biblical scholar from Emory, from Oxford, from Columbia, all these things, and I loved my training. I love what we do. Matt knows this. I love what we do. But I also know how we're trained, and we are not trained necessarily to pay good attention to those matters. So the art helps me to do the work that I don't trust that I can do on my own in my head, because I think that is the real work, that these texts aren't just matters of the head, but that these moments represent moments of the senses, of what you see, what you hear, what you feel, what you taste. I think in African American history, when you see the artist capturing the sensory aspects of it, it's not just that they're getting in the time machine, going back in time to this moment, recreating the sensory moment from the past. It is their sensory moment right now. In the 1920s, the teens. This is one of the heights of lynching, mob lynching. A lot of these artists have experiences with what mob violence looks like. They know, they have stories. If you read a lot of their autobiographies, they have stories of what it meant for the race parades to come past their homes and things like they don't have to reach far to recreate the sounds of what this kind of violence and crucifixion looks like. Those are the sounds that populate their everyday of their communities. And so what makes it so rich for me, and yet saddens me, is they don't have to use their imaginations in the same way to create it. There, in some ways, this is reportage. So Conti Cullen for me is the poem is very important. To what degree is Conti Cullen imagining this, and to what degree is he just reporting the way in which Jesus is being crucified again right here?
Wow.
Yeah, that's what I have.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. And I just know I'm going to get this question from somebody, and it's similar to some of the questions that people submitted that we didn't get a chance to get to. But can you name any particular resources people might benefit from if they want to look deeper into the Harlem Renaissance, or if they want to look deeper into how to be a reader of biblical texts, but also engage with visual arts and poetry?
Yeah. So there is, yeah. So now I'm gonna.
Who inspires you, basically?
I'm in my office, so I'm getting ready to pull a couple of things to show you. So right here, I'll give you two. Right here is a book. It's got a whole, because I'm using it right now, is a book. It's called Beholding Christ and Christianity in African American Art. So this is a book that is with me every day, every other day. And so you get to be introduced to a lot of these artists, particularly later artists. So it's called African American Art, Beholding Christ and Christianity. That's a text that's with me right now. The other is Aaron Douglas, actually inspires me quite a bit. Aaron Douglas, you got to see him as an artist. There's a book called, I'm destroying my office for you, Westminster.
We are grateful.
So this is Aaron Douglas, African American modernist. So this is a big, huge book about his art. Aaron Douglas inspires me because I went to Fisk University for part of my undergrad, and Aaron Douglas is known, as I said, the Dean of African American painters in Harlem Renaissance periods, but he settled in Fisk University. And so we have a whole gallery of Aaron Douglas's works, at least we did. And so I would go and do my work in religious and philosophical studies, sitting in the room where Aaron Douglas painted all of these silhouettes of African American history and his art, as a way to inspire me to feel like my voice matters, this work matters, and to center me. And so Aaron Douglas is someone that is with me all the time. The last person that I would say, and you heard it in my bio, is quite frankly, Howard Thurman. So Jesus and the Disinherited, Thurman's book on Jesus and the Disinherited changed my life in the sense of what it meant for me to be a biblical interpreter, and how I could interpret the text, paying attention to, like I said, the women, those that are oppressed and disinherited, and still be very scholarly in it. What a lot of people miss with Howard Thurman's works, particularly Jesus and the Disinherited and beyond, was how deeply informed and shaped by, in fact, the Jesus Seminar and the historical Jesus quest that he was. Like you'll read his writings, he was all the way up on all of this, and was in fact engaging these scholars, even while he's sitting up here producing his own interpretation of Jesus in the Gospels and the biblical text. So these are sort of the three sources shaping my work, shaping my voice, and hopefully you will find some opportunities for you as well.
Thank you. We have a hard stop coming up, so I have to end the conversation here, but I want to do two things. And first, most important, is thank you, Shively, for really for feeding our heads and our hearts with what's coming out of your own head and heart. So thank you very much on behalf of the entire congregation. They'd be standing and clapping for you if you were here in person, maybe someday after this pandemic. So thank you. The second thing I have to do is remind everybody about what's coming up. Tuesday at noon, Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. is speaking at the Westminster Town Hall Forum, James Baldwin's Lessons on Race in America at noon Central Time. Encourage you to tune into that. Next Sunday, we will be taking some excerpts of his lecture and his conversations with Tim Hart Anderson and playing those and having some conversation around that to follow up on what he has to say about James Baldwin, about the election you might have heard about this last week. So do come and join us next Sunday at 9:15. Thank you. The worship service is coming up on this channel next. The prelude should start in about 7 to 10 minutes.